So the idea of the 5 from 5 project is to try to make sure that the enormous amount of reading instruction research that is out there gets translated into classroom practice. That has not been happening for a long period of time for whatever reason, and it's so fantastic to see that happening here over the last year or so in particular, and there's really great evidence that that is actually happening in South Australia today. So congratulations, and this is a fantastic thing for me to see after so many years of trying to promote this evidence. To actually see it being adopted is really wonderful. So those of you who've heard me speak before will have heard some of this before, because obviously the reading instruction research doesn't change between me giving various different talks. So to some extent, there'll be some familiar material to some of you, but I have tried to go a little bit deeper into some of the theories and the scientific evidence around reading instruction and why, in particular, and I'm focusing on phonics especially today, why that works and how it works, with the assumption that you're all pretty much across the basics in terms of phonics, and having that deeper level of knowledge will help you to deepen your expertise in your teaching practice. So we'll set the scene a little bit first and talk about, why this debate over how children learn to read, and it is an ongoing debate. As the science is settled, there are some areas around effective reading instruction that practitioners and researchers still have some debate about, but essentially we know that children need to learn the alphabetic code in order to read proficiently, and that a systematic and explicit approach to teaching that alphabetic code is the most effective way. At the moment, though, there is still this debate between people who advocate for a code-based approach, and we say that phonics is necessary but not sufficient for learning to read. Phonics is one of those big 5 or big 6, whichever you choose to go with. It's not enough, but it's essential. Whole language advocates tend to argue that phonics is not necessary for learning to read. So explicit instruction in phonics in particular, so there'll be an acknowledgement about the alphabetic code, but that explicit instruction isn't necessary for children to learn that code, that they will learn it just by being exposed to text. So in whole language approaches that have been around for a few decades, and they are still around today, no matter what anyone tells you, they're out there, and there may be different names that are being used for whole language, but it's still well entrenched in a lot of policies and in a lot of schools, and particularly in education faculties in universities. It has its foundations in social view of reading, and it was based heavily on the theories of a writer, a researcher, an author called Frank Goodman, and he said that children discover how to read just by reading, so the way that we learn spoken language. He argued there was no need for explicit instruction, as have many of the people who have followed him in that whole language camp, and they argue that learning phonics is boring. And it just leads to reading without meaning. And it is really the basics of reading. However, when we're talking about phonics today, we are talking about cutting edge. We're talking about what we now know based on an enormous amount of cognitive science research and applied classroom practice, that teaching a phonics approach, or teaching phonics using a systematic approach, is the most effective. It's about learning correspondences between letters and sounds. We start with simple words that when we look at them frequently, they develop our sight vocabulary. But the most important thing is that generalisation. So Douglas Fisher was talking about that this morning, that transfer. So once you know the alphabetic code and you know how it fits together to make words, that skill and that knowledge base transfers to everything you're reading. And what I'm going to talk about today is how that process occurs. So as I said, the reading wars are still going on. I know, because I'm on the battlefront of that every day, and it's still quite heightened to some extent. If you have any doubt about that, I'd encourage you to have a look at the video of a phonics debate that this CIS hosted with the Australian College of Educators in July last year. You can find the video and the transcript for that on the 5 from 5 website. And it shows that debate really is still alive and well, if there are any doubters about that. So part of the reason that this continues is because there are a lot of children who do learn to read without synthetic phonics instruction. You can't doubt that. That's true. And these children have been able to glean the alphabetic code and the way phonics works and the way language works through various different methods, through their own reading. Perhaps they're being given some hints by their teachers, by their parents. And so therefore most children do learn to read through a variety of different methods. However, it's about, again, as Doug said this morning, there is a quicker and more efficient way. So why leave it up to children to discover the alphabetic code over a long period of time? And eventually probably they will, but think about all the things they could have been reading if they had known that alphabetic code, because it had been taught much earlier than that. So there's an opportunity cost in leaving it for too long and letting children make those discoveries for themselves rather than explaining how it works and making it so much easier for them. There is a tendency to characterise or caricature each other's sides of the argument to create straw man arguments. The general argument that is thrown out against what I'm saying is that I say that phonics is everything and you don't need to teach anything else, that I ignore vocabulary, comprehension, all of that sort of thing. Obviously, that's not true. However, it doesn't stop people making that argument. Balanced literacy is often something that's put forward as a best of both worlds situation. Often it's not. Often it's whole language with a little bit of phonics thrown in. So just be wary about the language around that. So a code-based approach teaches phonics, which is that body of knowledge. It's not just a skill. I've seen phonics described as a skill. It's not. The skill is being able to apply phonics knowledge, but it's a really rich and complex set of knowledge that starts relatively simple, and this is the beauty of a systematic approach. It starts relatively simple, but then expands into a very complex set of knowledge. So the idea that phonics is boring is completely incorrect. Phonics is a study of history to some extent, how our language has evolved and got to the point where it is now. So instruction is about the ways in which children are taught to use phonics to read. Another one of the arguments that's often made against teaching phonics in a systematic and explicit way is that English is just too complicated and that the rules are random, or there is no rules, it's just random, and therefore you just have to learn the words and just somehow or other know it. And it's true, English is a pretty complex language. We've got 26 letters in our alphabet. They are used to make an assortment of around about 200 graphemes, depending on spellings in various different countries. And those graphemes are used to represent 44 phonemes. So that means that there's some pretty complicated relationships there between letters and sounds. It's very difficult compared to some other alphabetic languages. So languages like Finnish, Italian, Spanish as well have a much more simple relationship between their letters and sounds. So pretty much a one-to-one correspondence. So once you've learned on all the letter-sound relationships, and they're pretty straightforward, there's nothing like 200, you can go on to read. And that's part of the reason for Finland's success in assessments like PISA. Most children in Finland have learned to read by the end of the first year of school. In English-speaking countries, it's more like the end of their third year of school. By the end of year 2, most children will have mastered the complex code. So of course it's going to take longer then to get onto those higher order skills if it takes longer to develop the lower order ones. Having said that though, it's not random. There are some spelling rules in the English language. Most words in the English language follow grapheme phoneme correspondence rules to a sufficient extent that you can get a pretty good handle on what that word is, even if there is a letter in there that doesn't follow the typical GPC rules. Generally, that's going to be a vowel sound. The vowel sounds are the trickiest part of our language, and they're the ones that take the longest to teach, but you can get pretty close, and it's certainly better than trying to remember every word as a whole word or to guess from the picture. So English language and English writing system is not just about the phonic relationships, it's also about morphemes. And this is another area of language study that's really interesting for children, particularly when it comes to spelling, making spelling choices based on what morpheme a letter or a sound is placed within. So if you know that the morpheme that you're working with in photo is part of the group of words that have the morpheme photo, you know that it's going to be a PH choice for the F sound and not an F choice. And there are lots of different rules around morphemes that help with spelling. So the phoneme is the single unit of sound that helps you distinguish one word from another. A morpheme is the unit of meaning. So there are various different types of morphemes. Unfortunately, sometimes the pronunciation of a morpheme in a word changes when you change the affix. However, once you know morphemes, that helps children to understand the meaning of a word when they come across it in text. So where does phonics fit within this big 5 or 6? I know you talk more about the big 6 here, whereas I have usually talked about the big 5. I fit oral language generally within the vocabulary and comprehension element. It's language comprehension. However, I don't have any objection. I'm not going to die on a hill over that one. Oral language is undoubtedly important, and it may deserve its own space. In the work that I'm doing, though, I incorporate it within the other 5. Where does phonics work in learning how to read? And Julie, again, if you were here at the session before me, talked about the simple view of reading. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about the reading brain, what we know about the reading brain and what it tells us about the importance of phonics and why it's essential. And also about the difference between beginning and skilled readers, because that is a really key sticking point in a lot of this discussion about learning to read. A lot of the whole language, or what they tend to call now phonics in context, a lot of the phonics in context approach is based on analysis of what skilled readers are doing. However, what beginning readers are doing is a very different cognitive process. And it's essential that we understand that, because that is how we will be able to address how they learn to read. So the simple view of reading has been around for a couple of decades, and it essentially says that reading comprehension is a function of decoding and of language comprehension. If your language comprehension processes, that it means like your receptive language, so your vocabulary, your ability to understand spoken language is poor, and your ability to decode, so essentially to work out what is the word on the page, is poor, then you can't read. Both of those things are 0. If you have good language comprehension processes, but you can't work out what the word on the page is, then you're still not reading. If you are in any of those 3 quadrants there, so if there's any part of the decoding or the language comprehension is either deficient or absent, then reading is going to be next to impossible. So good reading comes from knowing both of those things, working out accurately what the word is on the page. And accurately is a key word there, because decoding leads to accurate word recognition. Not guessing, not some sort of approximation. It's actually reading what's on the page and then having the vocabulary to know what that word is, both in a single word context, but also in a sentence and passage context, because sometimes they're not necessarily immediately the same thing. And there's an enormous amount of research backing up this, what seems like a really straightforward idea. And it's called the simple view of reading because the model is simple, not because it says that reading is simple. Obviously it's not. But there's a huge amount of research supporting this, and particularly research that has developed this concept, showing that initially decoding is the major part of that equation, and over time, as children master decoding, the language comprehension element becomes the most important. So at various different points as children progress through their learning of reading, different sets of skills will constrain their progress. So it's important to be aware about that. And that's where we think about, well, what is the balance? Where should the priority be? And the balance in terms of time and instructional effort at various stages. So that's that equation, that reading comprehension is decoding times language comprehension. It continues, as I said, to this model withstand empirical evaluation. So as I said, enormous amount of research that found that those 2 elements explained almost entirely the variance in reading instruction amongst different groups of children. The simple view of reading is also backed up by what we know about the reading brain. Written language is relatively new in evolutionary terms. So we have not yet evolved a reading part of our brain. We are using parts of our brain that were evolved to do other things, to recognise faces, to recognise symbols, to recognise language, and we have to somehow or other, as we're learning to read, make connections between those 3 things. There isn't a part of the cortex that just sort of switches on and says, okay, I can read now. It's not like spoken language. It's not a natural ability. It's something, there's a technology that was just, it's a code essentially, someone made up a few thousand years ago, and we have to help children to master it. So one of the interesting experiments that has shown this was by Brian Byrne, who has done some really fantastic research. He's one of the leading researchers in this area in the world, and we're lucky enough to have Brian in Australia. This experiment where he was working with preschool age children, and they were shown pairs of words like fat and bat and other different words that were, had a different onset, same rhyme, and helped them or tried to get them to learn those words just as individual words without analysing the word content. This word here is the word fat. Okay, so the children learned to recognise the word just from the whole word. And that's just, your normal standard sight word type rote learning. However, when they were shown a different set of words and asked to work out which was, say, fun and which one was bun, based on the fact that they knew fat and bat, they didn't know. So they couldn't make that analysis themselves. They didn't work out that the difference between those words that changed the pronunciation was that initial letter and what that initial letter looked like. So they didn't work out the alphabetic principle without that help of analysis. However, the same children, once they were shown how to analyse those words into the phonemes and the letters that represented them, they could. They could work out which word was which. So that just showed that this information can't just necessarily be induced by being shown something and actually doing that analysis themselves, particularly amongst children of that age. Phonics works because it makes those connections between the written word that we can see on the page, the word that we hear, and the word meaning that we have stored. So what then is the best way to learn that mapping? Because that is something that does take some time and usually requires some sort of effort. So learning this mapping is not easy for children, especially it has to be done systematic. So if you try to teach children the word cat and go straight from the letter or the words that are on the page to the meaning, that's not going to work. Because there's no systematic relationship between the letters or the written word and the animal itself in the case of cat. So there's no relationship. Things that sound the same, like cat, pat, bat, there's no relationship there between what the word looks like and what it's actually representing in terms of meaning. So children need to go via the sound. They need to be able to either say the word verbally or mentally in order to access the meaning of the word, because there is a systematic relationship between the print and the sound. So that's the code we're talking about. It's that systematic relationship between print and sound that doesn't exist between print and meaning. We'll unpack that a little bit more in what's called the dual root model and how that explains the difference between beginning and expert readers. Keith Stanovich, again, amazing researcher in the field of reading. Stanovich was, I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly popularised the idea of the Matthew effect and the way that reading actually changes the brain of children. Absolutely encourage you to read on Keith Stanovich. So phonics is what allows children to work out words for themselves without having to be told what it is, and that's through a self-teaching mechanism, which again I'll talk about. So eventually children do learn to read by sight, but it's not what we talk about in terms of teaching sight words. And so I'll explain what I mean by sight words in terms of the reading research in a few minutes as well. So phonics helps them to get to that point. So we don't want to confuse the endpoint, and that's what happens a lot of the time, particularly in reading debates about how children learn to read. Getting to the endpoint can't be confused with the way that we teach it. So obviously comprehension is the endpoint, making meaning is, as the buzzword is. Making meaning is the endpoint, that's not your starting point. Your starting point is making the connection between the code and the sound and then the meaning. So, for example, this is an analogy with learning how to play music skillfully. You don't learn to play by listening. You have to be taught and you have to practice. There are foundational skills that are required in order to be able to play the piano. Sure, you can probably pick out a few tunes by memory or by ear, but it's not going to allow you to sit down and play anything that you want. You need to learn to read, literally read music, and so it's a great analogy for reading. Phonics is not barking at print. That's something that I hear a lot. Phonics allows children to get to the meaning of a word via speech. So the sounding out and the saying is not evidence that they are not really reading. That's a natural part of the progression from knowing phonics into comprehension and making meaning. So that being able to sound things out and know what the word says and be able to hear it in their heads or from their mouths is an essential step for most children. If not with simple words, but then as they encounter more complex words as well. So as I said, beginning readers are different to skilled readers. We are reading as skilled readers in ways that we don't really even consciously understand what processes are going on in our brain as we are reading. And sometimes we are so proficient at reading that we can be thinking about something else entirely while we're reading. We can be at the point where we're playing a video in our brains as we're reading. We are so proficient in that. But what a beginning reader is doing is something very, very different. So the dual root model explains the differences in terms of how children learn to read. So I'll talk about skilled readers first. So they use one of two ways to recognise a word that they're reading. So they'll see a word in print, they'll identify what the letters are, and all of this is happening in a split second, in fractions of a second for a skilled reader. They recognise that word, they think about what the spoken word is, and they can produce that into speech or retrieve the meaning from their brain if they're reading silently. And there's two ways to do that, and one is by applying the letter sound rules, and the other is sort of because they're proficient, a rapid retrieval of the meaning without actually having to think too much about what the letter sound rules are and what that word might sound like out loud. So, for example, again, coming back to cat, a great example because it allows me to show you a picture of my cat as we get along through the slides. So you identify the letters if you're a skilled reader, again, split second, you recognise the word, you've seen it a million, billion times, and you're, okay, cat. That's what that is, and there's my cat, Milton. You retrieve what that spoken word is if you're reading aloud, and you can produce the sound if you need to. So that's a word that you know as a skilled reader. So what about if you come across a word you've never seen before? How do you work out what that is? Well, you go back to your letter sound rules. You recognise, again, this is a nonsense word, but there could be, any kind of word that you come across, and we still do, as people who read a lot, come across words we haven't seen before, people's names, place names, technical language. That happens all the time. Think about what might that word be, apply your letter sound rules, and then work out what it probably sounds like. If you know what it means, then you'll get to the meaning. With novel words, proficient readers still use that letter sound decoding process. With their known words, they can go pretty much straight away to the word meaning without having to consciously do that. With novice readers, they don't have that side of the dual root model yet that has allowed them to make that rapid connection between the letter or the word they see on the page and the meaning that they have in their brain. They need to have the sound of the word activated for them first. So they are generally just using this top part of the process, at least initially. So again, cat, they need to be able to say the word verbally or in their minds, and then if they're reading aloud, to produce it in speech, and then come back to the meaning, which they know from the sound of the word. So eventually, as children do this more and more often, once they've seen the word cat multiple times, for some children, it will only take 2 or 3 exposures to the word cat, and they've got it. No problem. It's part of their mental lexicon. There are other children that's going to take multiple, dozens of exposures for them to make those connections between letters and sounds and embed that to the extent where it becomes a rapid retrieval the next time they see it. And that is why this systematic approach is so essential for those children. It needs to become a mechanism that they can go back to, a fallback option all the time if they need to. Proficient readers who have, and beginning readers are starting to build up as they read a mental lexicon in their brain by a process called orthographic mapping. So it's not the case, and again, they are learning these words, they become what we call sight words, but they're not remembering them as a picture. They're remembering them as a letter string that is unique and that is precise. So, and each letter in that letter string is remembered in its precise location. So if you're reading a passage and there's a typo, and you've got 2 letters in a word have been mixed up, generally in the context of a sentence you can work out what that word is supposed to be. But our brain takes a little while to get to that. It has to go through a bit of a matching exercise to try and work out what that is, because it knows that that's not quite right. So when we see eye tracking research and we have people reading words that are just spelled slightly incorrectly, their gaze will stay on those words just a little bit longer as they try to make sense of it, because their brain knows that that's not quite right. So that is one of the sets of information that allows us to know that it's not just a picture or a symbol for a whole word. It is literally still those letter sound connections. So as children develop through orthographic mapping their mental lexicon of words that are sight words that they can rapidly retrieve, they're also beginning to understand what are the patterns among words. What are the spellings that look right when they're reading and when they're spelling. So it's an exercise in what we call statistical learning. So they start to make sense of the structure and the rules around written language. And then as they build on that through learning explicitly the extended code, then that becomes much more embedded, find spelling and reading much more easy. There's also evidence that this orthographic mapping process helps vocabulary development. So research has shown children more likely to remember a new vocabulary word if they know how to spell it, because it helps them to store it. If they know the spelling, it helps them to make the connections between the sounds that they can hear in the word, and also through that morphemic analysis, what that word is likely to mean and how to produce it. And again, as Doug was talking about this morning, it's language production that helps with language learning. And so that orthographic mapping and vocabulary relationship is a great example of that. So one of the ways that we help kids with orthographic mapping is to do things like this. So Elkonin boxes or sound boxes or whatever you do. And this is a great way. I mean, we normally do this initially at least with phonemic awareness to help children to make that or form that understanding, or to be able to hear that how a word can be broken up into sounds. And breaking a word up into sounds isn't the same as breaking it up into letters. But this helps them with that process of seeing the relationships and the patterns in words, and to embed those letter sound relationships in their brains. So the orthographic mapping process, which occurs through really explicit teaching of phonics, lots of practice, decodable books, etc. Once they've started to establish that, children start to self-teach. So this is a concept that was first put forward by Share, and again, so S-H-A-R-E, and I've got references for all of this stuff on the 5 from 5 website if you go to there. And children, sometimes when children are taught, that simple early code, that will kickstart them into reading, and they start to build on that knowledge themselves through independent reading. So that's the self-teaching hypothesis. Every time they read, they see new words that look like ones that they've seen before and start to make those connections themselves. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just teach a simple code and then away they go. There's still a lot of merit in teaching the extended code, because again, we don't want to leave it to chance. We don't want to assume that all children are going to learn that extended code through reading and through self-teaching, but that is a really important part of the process. So we do that all the time. We still do that as proficient readers. We just don't know that we're doing it. So Dr. Seuss books are a great example of this. And these really are fantastic books when children get to a reasonable level of decoding, because they are great fun, and they are decoding because they're full of nonsense words. Dr. Seuss is full, and so is lots of great children's and adults' literature is full of nonsense words. So to read this and to have fun with the rhyming and the made-up words, that's an example of the self-teaching hypothesis. And this is really, his books are deliberately constructed in this way. And again, another example of how phonics is fun. So how do we help these orthographic mapping to develop? You can't actually kind of teach it, but there are ways that you can facilitate its development. So things like the sound boxes that I mentioned, and mapping between graphemes and phonemes. So looking at the connections between words that look and sound the same. And I don't necessarily mean teaching onset and rhyme, looking at the phonemes as well, but helping children to really embed, and that's practice. That really is largely practice and exposure. So one of the theories that is often put forward around how children read is that they just sample print, and therefore phonics and learning letter sound relationships isn't all that necessary. And again, this came from Goodman's writing 4 decades ago. The reading's a psycholinguistic guessing game. So he was looking at kids who already knew most of the words they were reading. And so they were making guesses at the words they didn't understand using the context. So we now know that that's not true, that it's not a guessing game, that accurate reading requires high levels of decoding and being able to actually read the letters or read the words using letter sound relationships. That if you're relying on guessing, it's a really inefficient strategy and really inaccurate. It takes longer to read a sentence if you're having to think about all those other things before you finally get to, well, actually, why don't you just look at the letters and blend them. There's a lot of evidence showing that you don't need the context of a word to read it, and that's the basis of a lot of that argument. You can just put a single word up on the screen. I can show you a single word and you can read that word. You don't need the context of it, and you will know vaguely what the definition will be, which may change on the context, but you can at least read it. So the 3 queuing system, and that is still being promoted through lots of different associations and in different textbooks. And again, it's built on that model of what skilled readers are doing. It's not what beginning readers need to do in order to work out what the word is that they don't know. So obviously if you're reading, you're a skilled reader in terms of you can read relatively well and accurately, you're using semantic and syntactic cues largely to comprehend. In terms of working out what an unfamiliar word is, you need to go to the graphophonic cues first. And then you use things like semantics and syntax to check, or to what we call set for variability. So an example is if you come across the word wind in a sentence, is it wind or wind? So you use the context to make that decision. You set for variability, it can be wind or wind, but you know that it's either wind or wind because you can use phonics to decode it. If you didn't know that, then wind or wind could have been pretty much any 4-letter word that you can think of, and the context is not going to help you at all. So it helps you to narrow down the options, even with words like wind and wind, and tear and tear. There are so many examples of that. I come across things like this all the time. There's also the reader's zoo, and that get your mouth ready and blah blah blah, skip a word, etc. No, look at the letters. Think about what you know about what sounds they represent. Sound them out, and that's just such an obvious thing that should be the very first strategy. And yet, some of this advice to teachers and to parents about how to read with children is just torturous. It takes forever. And you can understand why parents in particular tear their hair out, because it's really difficult to work with or help a child to read if you're asking them to guess, essentially. Of course, they're going to get it wrong a lot of the time if they're guessing. So methods of teaching phonics, there are quite a few. So they start from your less systematic ones, so balanced literacy, for example. There is a little bit of phonics in there, but it's not systematic. It's generally pointing out letter-sound relationships in the context of reading a big book, for example. Or using, so there's particular text that you're working on or books that you're working with that week in terms of your shared reading and so on, and you might sort of identify a letter sound or a digraph or whatever that's present in that book and just have a talk about that. That's not a systematic, and then never sort of think about it again at any point. You don't bring it into spelling, you don't bring it into vocabulary, it's just sort of, we do this now, for no particular reason other than it just happens to be here, and then we never really talk about it again. So that's not a systematic approach to teaching phonics. The more systematic approaches are analytic and synthetic. So analytic is starting from the whole word and then looking at the comparisons or the patterns in words, looking at words that sound the same, have the same, or from the same word family. So that's analytic phonics is mainly talking about word families. And synthetic phonics, however, is breaking things down into their smallest components. So synthetic doesn't mean fake, it means starting from the smallest building blocks of words, and that's the phoneme. Part of the reason that synthetic phonics is so effective is that it reduces the cognitive load. So there are far fewer phonemes and graphemes, even though there's a lot of phoneme-grapheme correspondences in written English, there are far more word families. There's thousands. So if you're trying to teach every word family in the English language, that's a much bigger memory and cognitive load than actually learning the grapheme-phoneme correspondences and then putting them together and then seeing how, they then eventually end up in word families. But you start with the phoneme. Plenty of evidence over the last 20 years, and I'm just going to point to a couple of the major ones that might be further reading for you. The National Reading Panel is now pretty old, but a lot of that stands up, and a lot of its findings would still be relevant today, and more recent research has just supported the conclusions of the National Reading Panel rather than contradicting them. And it found that systematic and explicit phonics instruction makes a bigger contribution to children's growth in reading and spelling than all programs that are unsystematic or don't have phonics instruction. Back in 2000, they didn't talk about synthetic phonics. That term wasn't really part of the language of reading instruction and reading research. However, when you go beneath those summaries and you look at the research that was part of that analysis in the National Reading Panel, the studies that they were looking at most closely resembled synthetic phonics. So synthetic is the most systematic and explicit version. So some people argue, well, that because it doesn't say synthetic phonics in the National Reading Panel, then therefore it actually contradicts or doesn't support synthetic phonics. But when you actually look at what was part of those programs that they looked at, very close to what we would think about as synthetic phonics today. Our own Australian National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy, again, still stands up to the test of time this many years later. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I certainly encourage you to do so. And the Rose Report in the UK followed up those two, the Australian and the American report. But this time, this is where synthetic phonics really sort of became part of the language and defined much more tightly what we were talking about in terms of phonics instruction. And that's where the Rose Report was very influential. It was much more specific about what it meant, about what is exemplary phonics instruction. What does it mean to teach in an explicit and systematic and sequential way? So as a result of the Rose Report, the teaching of synthetic phonics became mandatory in UK schools, and there was several years later, a bump up in terms of results on the key learning assessments over the next few years. And then about 5 years after that, they started with the phonics check, which then resulted in another bit of a bump up. Because, as always happens, when you haven't got some sort of assessment that will show you whether or not the instruction has been effective, then it's really difficult to know. And a lot of teachers who thought they were teaching phonics effectively, the phonics check showed them that there was some room for improvement there. And so that led to not just a greater effort in terms of teachers' instruction, but also from the government. They realised that there was more support required there. It's not enough just to say, well, you must do this now, and not provide some support around that. More recently, for those of you who really are gluttons for punishment, these are some more recommended books. The first one is a journal article, which you'll be able to find online. It's been open access for a while. It is pretty heavy going in some ways, but hugely enlightening. It will help to make a lot of sense if you really want to dig down into the research on reading acquisition, particularly that movement from being a beginning reader to a proficient reader. Then that's a really good place to start. The Mark Seidenberg book has been extremely influential on a lot of people. Has changed the minds of a lot of people who thought that they had made their minds up about reading instruction, and Seidenberg's presentation of the evidence and the sorts of things I've talked about today is very persuasive. Much more at an accessible level is the New South Wales Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation report on effective reading instruction in the early years of school. The non-systematic methods that I talked about don't have a scope and sequence. The teaching's not explicit, and there are lots of programs that say they're explicit. It's one of those buzzwords that's become a bit of a weasel word, that people use it at any time in any context, and it's not necessarily what the research evidence would describe as what is explicit instruction. As I said, grapheme, phoneme correspondences, letter sounds are just pointed out, in the reading of text rather than presented in some kind of sequential way. Talking about language isn't done in using those explicit sort of really they're somewhat technical terms. Things like split digraph rules, etc., aren't part of a teaching program. And children are encouraged to predict the unknown words or guess them using the 3 cueing model. These are sort of markers of if these things are being used, it's not an explicit and it's not a systematic program. Analytic phonics is one of those non-systematic approaches. It's a less systematic approach. There is a system there, and there is some word analysis that's going on. It's just much more complicated in terms of teaching. It seems simpler. It sort of seems sometimes to make a bit more sense because, at least initially, it looks as though children are learning words more quickly if they're learning words in these word families, and all they need to do is just change the initial phoneme and away they go. Over time, though, however, it's a much slower process to cover all of that ground than it is to cover grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Synthetic phonics is the building up of words from its smallest part. So as I said, we start from the phoneme level. There's a sequence which is really carefully constructed to enable, to facilitate learning. So it's done in a way that will make sense. So I'll come back to the sequence again a little later. Another really important element of synthetic phonics is that blending is introduced really early. So if you've got a phonics program that teaches all the letter sounds before blending starts, that's not going to be very effective. Blending is an essential part of that process. And that's partly because sometimes the sounds of words or sounds of a letter can depend on the sound of the word next to it. So learning that co-articulation and how words fit together is an important part of understanding how those letters make words, how you can pull them apart, rearrange them, put them back together again. And that's a conceptual understanding that's important to develop as soon as possible. There's the explicit element, introducing the content, working on it together, and then allowing opportunity for practice. So the simple code, which is those, individual letter sound relationships, particularly the consonants that don't have a lot of variability in the way they sound in words, that can be learned in a few months. It shouldn't be a sound a week. That's too slow. So more than one sound. Now again, I'll talk a little bit about what might be the ideal number of letter sounds to introduce at the same time. But a sound a week won't allow you to start blending quickly, and that's an important thing to do. A synthetic phonics lesson will look like this, and this is built around the principles of explicit and direct instruction, that you review the content that's been taught previously, that you introduce the new content, the new sound or the new phoneme that you're going to be talking about. You make the association then with the grapheme that represents that sound in writing, how to use that grapheme in simple words particularly, and words that children know. You don't want to be introducing words they don't know, or words that have irregularities in that process. Again, reducing the cognitive load. Start with simple things. They're not trying to think about what is that word. They're thinking about what it is you want them to think about, which is that grapheme-phoneme relationship. Practicing using those letter sounds or grapheme-phonemes relationships in initially just words, then in sentence strips, and then in books, depending where they are in the sequence. And then again, depending on where they are in learning phonics, applying that into another context. So not just necessarily in sentence strips or in books, but in environmental print. So and also another great thing to do is use, once they've got to a certain level of proficiency with letter sounds, different fonts, so they can see how that transfers. So you don't want to do that too soon, but further down the track, you don't want to complicate things too early, but transferring and helping to transfer is quite important. And then assessment, of course. So checking as you go through. So not waiting until the end of the year to make sure that children have learned all of the letter sounds you want them to learn, but stopping and doing not just assessment of what has just been taught, but cumulative assessment, making sure that things that were taught at the beginning of the year are still there, a quarter of the way through the year, end of the year, so on. So that cumulative assessment and reteaching if necessary is an essential element of that. So how do you know if the program that you're using or that someone is trying to convince you to use is synthetic phonics? And there are quite a few good ones out there, but you don't need to necessarily buy one. If you have enough knowledge and you are able to put the time into it in your school, you can certainly develop one in-house. Using some principles, obviously it takes longer, and developing the scope and sequence and so on is difficult, or can be a little bit difficult, and it's the resourcing and so on. But these are the sorts of things to look for. So you want a clearly defined sequence of GPCs, so that sets out in what order the grapheme-phoneme correspondences should be taught, and which ones. So hopefully all of them, not just stopping after the simple code. Usually introduced at the rate of about 4 to 6 a week. Again, we know from cognitive science research that around about 6 to 7 items is as much as children can, or anyone actually, can hold in their working memory easily. So if you try to introduce too many, that's too much to remember. If you have too few, that's not enough to make words with. So you're not going to be able to do that blending that you want to be able to do. And it also makes it too slow to some extent if you only do a couple or one a week. You start with single letters and single sounds, so you can build that conceptual understanding. Moving on to the digraphs that are going to be most useful to them in their reading, and the ones that are generally those that have the fewest variations in the way they're pronounced. And then eventually your larger ones, your trigraphs and your quadgraphs. So there's not as many of those, and they do come up pretty regularly. And of course, you don't pretend they don't exist in your teaching because, and again, I'll talk about that in a moment, but this is generally the teaching sequence to make sure that it's all covered. Introducing blending almost immediately or as soon as a few sounds and letters are learned. Also introducing that segmenting process, the pulling apart and the putting back together. So blending is one side of that, segmenting is the other. Using the most common spellings first. So you wouldn't go to the spellings or the sounds that are not going to be very useful to them in their early reading. Start with the things that are going to be more common in the books that they will eventually be starting to learn as they move into independent reading. Helpful strategies for how they approach words that do have unusual grapheme-phoneme correspondences. So it's that idea of, well, what are the sounds that you know in this word? And then look at the one that is variable and put the one in that sounds right and makes the most sense. But that comes a little bit later. And again, making sure there's opportunities for word reading, and particularly for reading decodable texts, because that's going to form that reading habit that is decoding first rather than looking at picture cues. And that's a really great habit to develop, because we've all seen children who you say, well, if they get to a word they don't know and they look around the room for the answer in the sky and they look at you, and the habit has to be, well, the answer is here on the page. It's not in my face, it's not on the ceiling. And that's a strategy or something that sometimes it's difficult to break that habit for kids, or they feel as though, that because they don't know phonics, in some cases, it might as well be on the ceiling as on the page. So when I'm talking about explicit instruction, I'm talking about instruction where you're explaining, modelling and demonstrating, so making sure children know what it is that you want them to know and why. That your language is really clear and unambiguous, so try to decide what terms you're going to use. Some schools like to use the more technical terms, grapheme, phoneme, digraph. They like all that sort of stuff. Other schools, prefer just to use more common things like letters, sounds. And that's fine. Either is really okay. I find children actually really like using the technical language. They like showing off. They enjoy knowing something about language. They like new words and fancy words. But whatever it is that you choose, it needs to be common across the school. So all teachers are using the same language around reading, and there's no mismatch between classrooms. That there's a learning objective that everyone understands and knows. There's that modelling and the guidance, and then the practice and the feedback, and that's really important, that immediate feedback. And that, I think, is one thing that is misunderstood about explicit instruction, that it's seen as just chalk and talk, and it's not. It's very interactive, and the feedback is immediate, because you've got mostly explicit instruction is done, whole class and floor work. You've got all those faces in front of you, and there are ways that you can check for understanding and provide feedback immediately, because you can see who knows it and who's struggling. And it doesn't leave that learning to chance. It makes no assumptions about what children know and what they don't know. Everyone gets taught. It's systematic. There's a clearly planned sequence. It's not guesswork as you go along. The progression of skills is logical, starts with simple and moves to complex. There's those defined statements, as there is with explicit teaching. There's planned practice. So that's not just if we have time, we practice. The practice is a key component of the lesson, and making sure to activate those previously learned skills. So you don't want to just assume that what you've taught in previous lessons will come to mind as you teach the next one. If your sequence or the new content sits on top of old content, or will be better learned if it can be stuck onto it, if it fits logically into content you've already taught, can't assume that's there. Activating the old content is really important. So teaching those grapheme phoneme correspondences, again, there's a lot of research around this, and someone who has been really influential in this area is David Kilpatrick, and these are generally his principles. So some of those I've already been through. one of the things that David mentions is that using mnemonic letters, so using memory tools like mnemonic letters. So this is an example. So I don't mean your typical alphabet chart where it's just a C and a picture of a cat. So finding ways to incorporate whatever it is the sound that you want to activate or bring to mind when children see that letter. And the dinosaur, the D, is another fairly common one. The S for snake is one we all know, but there are some really lovely ones that are around. And again, it's just trying to reduce that cognitive load, help children to remember what those are. And again, that applies to the simple code. So S obviously can represent the S in snake, or the Z sound in is, for example. But this is at least, the simple code and helping to get a grasp on that. So Alison Clark has a website called Spellphabet, and she has some wonderful resources that you can... so a lot of them are free. Those that are not free are very reasonably priced, and she does that because she cares very deeply about trying to provide teachers with some help in this sort of area. And then there are grapheme phoneme charts. So again, not your typical alphabet chart. This is actually showing the different all the different spellings potentially that can represent one sound. For some children, this is extremely helpful. For some, it's a little bit overwhelming. And again, you'll know which is correct for your students, whether they're ready to be offered all of these options, or whether you wait for part of the way through your teaching sequence before you start to show all the different alternatives for spelling. So these are available from Phonics International. And Debbie Hepplewhite provides a lot of fantastic phonics teaching resources online for people who are interested. So that's one with pictures. There are some that are separated into the vowel phonemes and the consonant phonemes, and that can be really helpful as well. The vowel phonemes, as I said, tend to give children the most trouble because they're the most variable. And having this chart isn't cheating. It's very helpful. There's no reason not to have this sort of stuff available for children when they're, particularly for spelling, to not have to guess. The information's there. Get it right the first time, as much as possible. So in terms of your scope and sequence, there's no accepted gold standard. This is the best scope and sequence. But there are a few principles that it's useful to follow if you're developing one within your school or if you're choosing one from those that are available. And they're things like separating letters that look the same or sound the same. Again, to try and avoid that B and D confusion that a lot of children have, particularly dyslexic children, but not necessarily just them. So if you can separate them so that confusion is not arising while they're trying to learn the letter sound, that's really helpful. The more useful letter sounds first, starting with a small set and building up, starting with single letters before digraphs and trigraphs, a sufficient number of letter sounds per week. The other thing is to try, if you're using decodable readers, and I really hope you are, that they are consistent with your scope and sequence that you're using. A decodable reader is only decodable if you've learned the code that's in it. So there's no point asking children to read a decodable reader when they haven't yet learned those letter sounds. And it's just so much easier if your teaching sequence is the same as the decodable reader sequence. So that's sometimes a helpful way to decide what to do. And again, that whole school approach. Another really useful book, Isabel Beck, is usually more well known for vocabulary, but she has this great book on phonics instruction as well. She offers a general sequence, which follows along those lines that I mentioned. And, most of those... these books that, like David Kilpatrick, like the Beck book, Louisa Moats, for example, you will find a huge amount of commonality in their advice. There might be a little bit of change, a bit of difference around the margins, but these are the sorts of things they will all, without fail, say are very useful guides in terms of phonics instruction. So there are programs around that essentially follow these rules. They won't have exactly the same scope and sequence, but it will be generally along those same lines. The National Literacy Learning Progressions, happily, also follow those guidelines. So you don't have competing advice. You don't have this literacy progression that's saying you need to do one thing, and then you've got advice coming from researchers saying something else. And of course, that's not a coincidence. That this advice from those great researchers has been taken into account in the development of these progressions. So I did mention incidental learning. It's not the case that if you're teaching a phonics sequence that you pretend all of those other letters and sounds don't exist. It's only the 3 that you teach or 4 that you're teaching that week. So there's environmental print, children's names. There's all kinds of information that children are getting. So it's great to talk about that. They're going to be reading, looking at books. They're going to come with some knowledge already. So teaching in a sequence doesn't mean that you discount all that or ignore it or pretend it's not there. You acknowledge it. But the idea of the scope and sequence is to make sure all of the content is covered for all students, but particularly those who don't bring with them that knowledge. I will just say something really quickly about sight words as a teaching method rather than that orthographic mapping process. So teaching sight words as sight words without the analysis of the phonemes is not a highly recommended strategy, except for there's few high frequency words that aren't easily decodable and things that can kickstart kids on their reading journey. So it's great to and even those words that don't necessarily fit exactly the phonics rules, things like was, said, of, at least initially, to look at the parts of those words that do fit, that do make sense, and that's going to make them easier to learn as sight words as well. I still see this quite a bit, please don't do this. Lynn Stone calls these word coffins. This is not going to help any child to learn these words, so avoid, please. Look, I'm not going to be too hard on shut-up sheets. I think sometimes worksheets can be okay. It helps to practice, used in moderation, like anything. But this is definitely not a good worksheet. That's pointless and a waste of everyone's time. I'll stop now, but all of this stuff is going to be available online for you if you want some more information about implementing a synthetic phonics program and what to think about as you go about that in your school and further reading. Okay, thank you.